Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Nancy Drew Mobile Mysteries Shadow Ranch. Right now, we're at Dry Creek, which would be the ghost town, and we're going to explore the general store. Walls of dusty shelves, piles of moth-eaten burlap bags, and a plank floor littered with broken barrels, empty tin cans, and dirt greet the girls as they enter. Guess I won't be buying anything in here, Bess grimaces. You're about 120 years too late, Nancy says, making her way to the counter. Wonder what it was like to be the last person to leave Dry Creek, George muses. Nancy opens an old, thick book that sits on the counter and begins to carefully turn the pages. Well, I can tell you what that person's name might have been. George joins her. What's that, a ledger? Nodding, Nancy reads off some of the notations scrawled in faded ink on one of the pages. Calvin Moore, 5 shovel heads, 99 cents, paid in full. Tobias Richter, 1 sewing kit, 25 cents, paid in full. Lizzie Applegate, assorted sheet music, 11 cents due. Lizzie Applegate was featured in Nancy Drew, Message in a Haunted Mansion. Yeah, Lizzie had some sort of hidden treasure with lots of gold. I wonder if we'll find hidden treasure with lots of gold in this game as well. Good grief, they were practically giving stuff away back then, Bess exclaims. But don't forget, people only made like $1.75 a day back then, Nancy reminds her. They hear footsteps and turn to see Jim Wallace wander through the door. He smiles when he sees the girls. This town's pretty awesome, huh? George sneezes. Unless you're allergic to dust. She sneezes again, then turns to Bess and Nancy. My nose is not happy in here. Let's go check out the cemetery. As they head for the door, Jim suddenly remembers something. Oh hey, I found this outside. He wrests a rusty tuning fork out of his back pocket and holds it out to them. I don't feel like carrying it around. Anybody want it? Sure. Nancy takes it from him with a smile. Like my father always says, never turn down a free tuning fork. Once you visit all 3 locations in Dry Creek, you're automatically going to go to the cemetery. The girls head for the small hill at the edge of town, but the closer they get, the more uneasy Bess becomes, until finally she abruptly stops and announces, I don't want to go to the cemetery. It's okay, come on, George urges. Seeing what they wrote on people's headstones back then could really be interesting. You guys go. I'm going back to the jail to see if Dirk Valentine left any graffiti in there. She turns and walks away without waiting for a reply. George and Nancy look at each other, then continue on until they reach the gate at the foot of the hill. They stop and look up at the hilltop. Cemetery. Then over the rock-walled area below it. Oh yeah, okay, so we have 2 cemeteries. Good guys and bad guys. You want to go to the good guys because that gives you a collectible. Alternately, you could just go to the bad guys and then you'd automatically be there and you'd never visit the good guys cemetery, therefore you would never get the collectible. Let's start at the top and make our way down, Nancy suggests. The pair follow a barely visible path through the brush to the crest of the hill. There they study the epitaph on one of the few tombstones that remain upright. Sweet Sue is now at rest, Nancy intones. She was one of Dry Creek's best. Here's one that tipped over. George crouches in the weeds and squints as she tries to determine what's been carved on the fallen headstone in front of her. Here lies General Smedley. Many battles did he win until the measles did him in. Here's another one, Nancy says, pushing aside some brush. In each sunset you will find the golden promise of the dawn. Percy the poet. George grunts. Some poet? That didn't even rhyme. She has a point. What's that? George asks, pointing to a small stone statue off to the side of the hill. Well, that's for Francis Humber, Dave says, walking over to the girls. Sorry, couldn't help but overhear. Francis Humber. As in Dirk Valentine's girlfriend? Nancy asks. The same, Dave explains. Now, she ain't buried here, but you'll find lots of little remembrances for her around these parts. Nancy looks at the small, carefully crafted statue of a sad young woman looking worriedly over her shoulder. Why does it look like the statue is running away from something? Truth is, after they hanged Dirk, she spent the rest of her life on the run. No one ever saw her or heard from her again. That's not fair, George exclaims. She didn't do anything wrong. Why did she have to run away? Couldn't agree with you more. The story goes that she was too ashamed to show her face in town on account of what Dirk did. Dave lets out a long sigh and bends down to brush a smudge of dirt off of the statue before continuing. But the real truth is, folks back then thought Dirk had left some hidden treasure behind for her. She was worried if she stayed here she'd be kidnapped, or worse. Poor Frances, George says quietly. You sure do know a lot about her. It's a popular story. Plus, she's a distant relation on my mom's side. Really? Nancy asks, surprised. That's what brought me to Shadow Ranch in the first place. Dave gives the girls a quiet smile and tips his hat. That's enough out of me, though. Best leave you back to what you were doing. The girls slowly navigate through the overgrown graveyard, pausing to read the epitaphs that are still legible, until they decide they've seen enough. Still want to check out Boot Hill? Nancy asks. Absolutely! Alright, so here is Boot Hill. This is the cemetery for the bad folks. The two girls locate a narrow gate made of rusty iron bars in the rock wall. It creaks horribly as they push it open. George looks around the small, weed-infested enclosure with concern. I don't see any tombstones in here. Suddenly, a voice behind them says, That's because nobody cared if they fell over. The girls turn with a start to find themselves once again facing Andre Ferris. He smiles apologetically. Sorry, eavesdropping again. Showing off again, too. Ha, yeah. So you found some graves? Nancy asks, recovering from the fright he gave them. Oh, yes. Dry Creek definitely had its share of ne'er-do-wells. He points to something at his feet. Here lies Mean Jeanne. She never done right by nobody. Scanning the thick brush, Nancy soon spots another gravestone. Crouching, she reads the faded words carved there. Rotten Rudy, hanged July 5th, 1886, for horse thievery and such. No poetry for these guys, George comments. Then, holding some brush aside with her foot, she says, This one had a full name at least. Tobias Richter. He took our gold, we took his life. In point of fact, it was the town assayer, Andre interjects, gesturing towards the building where they first met him. Apparently, he made a habit of stealing a small portion of the gold miners would bring him for assaying. When the miners finally wised up, he shakes his head. Things got ugly. They never did find where he stashed it all. How do you know all this? Nancy wonders. Like I said, history buff, especially when it comes to the Old West. And these days, with the internet, anybody can become an expert on pretty much anything. He's interrupted by a long, piercing scream of terror coming from somewhere in the ghost town. That's Bess! George looks at Nancy with alarm. Both girls scramble through the gate and go racing towards the old sheriff's office. To the sheriff's!